Hello, it's Kevin Annett. It's November 8th, 2015. Today I'd like to read to you some excerpts from my upcoming book entitled Unrelenting. I want to start with a little bit of the history, the things that led me to my present situation. Going back to the year I was ordained. The year is 1990 and the location is southwest Manitoba, where I have my first charge as a United Church minister. Down the road from my home pastoral charge were my two smaller parishes of a few dozen people, remnants of once thriving communities when that leg of the railway was still operating. Lyleton still bore the resemblance of a town, although the post office had closed the year before I arrived. Its United Church was the only public building left in town, where on busy Sundays 10 or 15 congregants could be found singing the old hymns a cappella, since they had no organist, or more likely they were all staunch Presbyterians. The other parish, Coultervale, had evaporated long before, and its citizens were scattered in lone farmhouses like lonely sentinels in an unending night. My parishioners there used the abandoned community center for their worship services, but they could boast an organist at least, a cheery young fellow named Greg Fletcher, who pounded away on an old piano during the services and sang along with everyone to help out all the aged and stumbling voices. The following year, Greg Fletcher would choke to death at the dinner table in front of his new wife, Betty, but I was gone by then. The Downey family held sway in both towns. Leighton Downey was a kindly old man who was the chairman of the Coultervale Church, but he called the shots in Lyleton too, since long ago his grandfather had donated the land to the Presbyterians to build a church there. Leighton also helped me gain 10 pounds that year that I was there by his irresistible homemade baking, samples of which I always found faithfully placed on the seat of my Jeep after every Sunday service. 50 years before that, during World War II, Leighton and his brother Frank had married two sisters from nearby Brandon and brought them to their homestead farms west of the town. A year later, the sisters had lost their baby brother at the shooting gallery called the Battle of Dieppe, and then a month later their oldest brother's Lancaster bomber was shot down over Germany. Commemorating the death of the two Downey brothers became the focal point of the religious life of both communities over the years, as if the determination never to forget them would somehow also preserve the spirit of those people that was dissipating like the good soil blown into four directions. I caught on to that central story in their lives early on, and it helped me to speak to them from the pulpit in something more than abstractions and metaphors. What was difficult and practically impossible was to get any of them to budge from their age-old pew positions in order to move closer to me during the Sunday service. It made sense, I suppose, in the still-standing church in Lyleton, where a tottering old woman of 90 once nostalgically pointed to her 8-year-old initial she had carved on the wooden pew an entire lifetime before. And she said to me, "My family and I have always sat there, Reverend, and I'll be here even after I'm gone to meet my Maker." Fair enough. Although I had to pretty much bellow to be heard to the bare dozen of the Lyleton congregation dispersed throughout the 200-person capacity church. But this stubborn stick-to-your-own-spot attitude seemed slightly ridiculous in the Coultervale congregation, where folding chairs constituted the pews and were rearranged every week. Regardless of that, everyone could always be found in exactly the same place every Sunday. And the one time I really caught with the Coultervale congregation was when I arrived early one week and decided to set up the chairs in a circle, with me officiating in the center. "And what the hell is all this?" demanded one of the normally quiet old ladies as she stood in the doorway. And that was that. It was more than a challenge to do all 3 of the Sunday services in the time allotted to me, and required a lot of fast driving down gravel roads to cover the 40-mile diameter of my charge. The Pearson church service was first at 9:30 a.m., then Lyleton at 11, and Coultervale at 12:30. They rotated every year, but the breakneck routine was sometimes hazardous. I once sped off into a ditch on my way to Lyleton, thankfully not during the winter, and a local farmer pulled me out with his tractor in time to make at least part of the service, bruised but intact. The local RCMP detachment came to know me quite well on the back roads, and parked cops would usually just wave at me as I sped by well over the speed limit, since they all knew where I was bound and why. After my first few weeks of the Sunday mania, Leighton Downey used to stand in the doorway of the community hall, pretending to look vexed when I ran up clutching my Bible and robe, tapping his watch with a fake scowl, and sometimes handing me a towel to dab the imagined sweat off my brow. It must have been a source of amusement to the different congregations, since none of the previous ministers had kept to the church schedule with that kind of precision. And sometimes I heard me referred to as the, quote, Indy 500 pastor in the co-op coffee shop in Pearson, to various choruses of laughter from the farmers gathered there, who obviously knew a Mountie or two. Those were really golden days for me, and not only from the natural joy of being a new father and minister, and a man very much in love with his wife, I was regularly surprised by heaven. One Saturday I was called out to do a funeral far out in the prairies south of Lyleton, practically on the North Dakota border. A small crowd awaited me at the cemetery atop a little forested hill. I'd have met normally with the family beforehand to get to know everyone before the service, but the deceased was a woman from outside the district with no relations who were still alive. And the undertaker in Melita knew that I'd do the service, and so he asked me. They were all strange and aged faces that welcomed me as I swung open the metal gate and stood over the casket in the open ground. It was a cold and blustery day. The mourners were all fellow residents of the care home where she had died, and apparently her death was not unexpected. So I said some prayers and words, and then asked if anyone had something to say about Eunice, the one who had left us. The wind was the only response, and for a while we all just stood there in our own thoughts, until finally a very old woman stepped forward and she spoke very softly, and she said these words, Eunice here was my dearest and oldest friend ever since we were 4 years old. I knew her through bad times and good ones. She lived here right through the droughts and all the depression, and she had 3 children and she lost 2 of them. But the worse things got, the better she got. And that was all that needed to be said. Some 3 years later, I ended up in Port Alberni on Canada's west coast, where a lot of this revelation of the residential school genocide was uncovered because of what I began to experience in that town and other things. But the word genocide is an abstraction to all of us. But before that word genocide came its reality. Before I spoke about the crime, I bore it in my own grasp the night that a little Indian boy called Arthur Gomez died. This was in October 1993. Now, Arthur Gomez was an odd name for an Indian, especially West Coast natives. But I never asked about it after getting the call to hurry to West Coast General Hospital. It was past midnight, and my own family was fast asleep. He's dead, Reverend. Our little boy, he's dead. His father met me on the ward, crushed, beyond help. The mother was passed out, drugged to dull her hysteria, and Arthur's tiny corpse lay beside her on the bed. I don't remember our words, for they meant nothing next to the little life that could never be lived. I do recall lifting that impossibly light body in my arms and carrying it to the bathroom sink, where, true to the Father's wishes, I baptized Arthur Gomez in the name of a reclusive God. The baby's hair was jet black and damp and still warm. I remember kissing that hair and handing the father his son. I never saw them again. Arthur was given a traditional New Chelmsford native burial, the kind denied so many other dead brown babies buried in secret just a mile from where Arthur had died. His mother had survived the Alberni Christian death camp called a residential school, although not really. But her subsequent drinking and drug taking had claimed her son in as sacred a place as her own womb. I spoke about Arthur Gomez the next Sunday in church. I was told it was inappropriate to do so. And finally, many years later in Vancouver, in the streets of Vancouver in 2012, my friend Harry Wilson died, another dead Native man. Harry Wilson died the way he had lived, unnoticed and battered. He had been one of the very first Port Alberni residential school survivors who had spoken out, and he usually showed up at all our demonstrations and radio programs. Afterwards, Harry and I always parted with something incomplete between us. as if we were preparing to never see each other again. That went on for years, because unlike most of the other residential school survivors, Harry beat the odds for a long time. Living on and off the street like most of our group did, Harry endured as if by a miracle. He regularly slipped his way into hospital bathrooms and drank off all the alcoholic hand wash from the dispensers. He bartered away his clothes for a Mickey of rye. Most of the time he couldn't string 5 words together without gagging or crying. But the years slipped by and Harry Wilson was still there. A special kind of fiber allows a boy to undergo anal rape and electric shocks to his penis and then speak about it 30 years later to strangers. Time and his enemies wore at this hard substance in Harry, but it did so only slowly, allowing the crime and his character to be known. But eventually it all caught up to him. I was out of town when he died. The city coroner was especially tight-lipped about how Harry had died. None of the usual excuses to cover the killing of an Indian were offered. Neither suicide, nor alcoholic poisoning, nor tuberculosis was given as Harry's cause of death. Nothing had caused it, apparently. He just died. I retain a picture of he and I in better times, on the eve of our first tribunal in the summer of 1998, when we thought that telling the truth would make a difference. Harry is smiling as best as he could in the photo, his arm self-consciously hooked around my shoulder. Harry could never be touched by anyone, but that day we were arm in arm. He always cried the hardest when he recalled finding the body of a young girl on the grounds of the Alberni Residential School when he was only 12 years old. She was small, covered in blood, and stone cold. She had died the way Harry would one day, which is perhaps why he never stopped talking about her, and why he never let go of her. Hello again, it's Kevin Annett. I'm reading another excerpt from my upcoming book, Unrelenting. This is from chapter 2, entitled The Malefactor. It began in small places we'll never see, like any incubating virus. Hidden and deadly, it formed itself into official pronouncement, papal statute, joint stock companies, and eventually ships and their crews. Armed with Roman law and European canons, it struck outwards to subjugate and seize the entire world. It killed mercilessly, and then it spoke of healing. We know the official accounts of this plague, having been carefully inoculated to it, and thus incapable of shrinking from its horror. It's all in the past. Things are so very different now. I was raised in the culture it spawned, and that spawned it. As a boy, I sat quietly through our well-ordered church services and learned how God favors certain people and not others, how God tossed our forebears into earthly suffering because they had disobeyed him. I learned to become permanently confused by loving a deity who'd even had his own dearest child betrayed and flogged and ripped to pieces on a cross. Soon I lost something that had been born within me, that was more than innocence, more like a nebulous presence that was everything, a breath that some lingering indigenous people envision as an animal spirit who accompanies us and links us to all of creation. My animus was bound in chains as if I became part of the plague, and I could imagine nothing but it. But somehow, years later, my time did come as a man, and my submerged spirit drifted out from its captivity so that I could finally understand the thing in which I had been raised, and that was responsible for the massacre of so many and so much. And being finally free, that spirit changed everything. The story of what we call genocide in Canada has been told, in part, but it has never been understood, because it's just a word. A life is very much the same. We can describe it, but we can never understand it. It is beyond understanding. I've spoken about the plague and what it did many times, but when my mouth opens to explain it, why it happened and what it actually is, another voice speaks instead, one that fogs more than it reveals. We're all like that. We're all children of the thing that we describe but never comprehend. I met this quandary the morning I handed a photocopied document to my fellow graduate students soon after my expulsion as a minister from the United Church. The page that I handed them was a report by a Dr. Peter Bryce that showed that half of the Indian children had died in the gulags we still call residential schools. The scholars looked at this document. They seemed briefly alarmed by it, and then they turned away from the mirror I had held up to them. It went on like that for many years, once I had become an exile to myself and my own people, and eventually even to the plague. I kept speaking to a barricade of backs. But truth slips past all of our arrangements, for it desires only to find a fertile nest in which to grow. And it did, even as the plague swept on. All of it changed me just like it did Canada and Rome. As opaque and unmoving as the arrangement appears, it must respond to a continual challenge, no matter how small. The thing adapts to each one of our assaults, but it is capable of dying. I stood next to myself outside the Vatican one October morning in 2009, and a new voice in me told an entity to leave that place. The next day, a tornado followed my words, and thus did I begin to understand. The plague came from us, not as an alien intruder from the outside. It moves and lives so easily among us and takes up residence again even after we have exposed and expelled it, because it is us. Only when I understood that could I do more than protest and expose it. I'm not a praying man, because I find I'm just talking to myself. Anyway, why does eternity require any sort of dialogue between me and itself? But I do know the power that has acted through me and dislodged the arrangement, a power that's just as much a part of me as the plague. That said, I sometimes feel that I was the problem all along. I never understood why so very few people were ever really bothered by the abomination that I revealed. My illusions crumble slowly. Still to this moment, I grow angry and weary when the world ignores what I am uncovering and what I am attempting, as if humanity should be anything other than what it is. My father said that the only problem with idealists like me is that we can't relate to most of the human race. Nor should you, he always adds with a smile. Hello once again, Kevin Annett, reading more from Chapter 2 of my upcoming book, Unrelenting. It's entitled A Day in the Life of a Fool. The Nazi called Adolf Eichmann, just like Reverend Alfred Caldwell, had children of his own. But unlike the SS men, Alfred Caldwell actually killed children, at least two of them that we know of, and their names were Maisie Shaw and Albert Gray. The boy died first, and then 8 years after that, the girl. Reverend Alfred Caldwell arrived with his family on the west coast of Canada in the fall of 1935 after 2 stints as the principal of United Church Indian Schools in Manitoba. He was given the job of cleaning up the Ahousaht Residential School after his predecessor, a man named William Wood, created a public relations nightmare for the United Church when he spoke to the press of finding, quote, ghastly and murderous conditions prevailing when he'd arrived at the school. Mr. Wood lasted 6 months and then ended up where even tranquil truth-tellers go. Alfred Caldwell, on the other hand, was a company man, the kind of Eichmann-like efficient bureaucrat who sees systems and not human beings. In his own words, the Reverend began plugging the leaks at the Ahousaht facility, not by providing regular food and clothing to the 200 Aboriginal children there, but by saving the United Church from any further controversy and exposure. He was an angry man. One day, 3 years after his arrival, the clergyman caught a 9-year-old Indian boy named Albert Gray taking an unauthorized prune from a jar in the school kitchen. His hunger cost Albert his life. He never knew what hit him, describes Archie Frank, who saw the beating. Caldwell beat the shit right out of him. Then he let him bleed to death in his room. Archie Frank, the witness, died as well, conveniently for some, just before I was to interview him in 1999. But his words, and those of another witness, Stanley Sam, had found their way into the Vancouver Sun newspaper soon after I was fired for doing what William Wood had done. Stanley Sam described, Albert's mattress was crawling with maggots when we found him dead. He'd never been treated or nothing, just left to die. We had to bury him out behind the Ahousaht school one night, and Caldwell said never to tell anyone or we'd end up just like him. Well, the plague rewards its own. After he'd killed Albert, Alfred Caldwell went on to an even loftier position as the principal of the Alberni Residential School, just a mile from where I would one day pastor for the same United Church. And there, on Christmas Eve of 1946, Alfred Caldwell kicked a little girl named Maisie Shaw down a flight of concrete stairs to her death because she wouldn't stop crying for her mother. I came to know the sole eyewitness to that murder in December of 1995 at a protest over my firing from the United Church that I had convened outside its general office in Vancouver. The witness's name was Harriet Nahanni, and one day her association with me would cost her her life as well. Harriet was an odd woman, perhaps because she had known Alfred Caldwell too well. The day after we met, I sat with Harriet in her smelly, mold-saturated apartment on the Squamish Indian Reservation. She told me that what Caldwell used to do to her all the time. The principal never spent much time sitting in his office or pushing paper. He had to know everything going on among his little brown charges. That included Harriet, especially since she was the daughter of a traditional chief, and that was a problem to Alfred Caldwell and many. Harriet says, he always singled me out for rape. He'd invite in some of his friends to watch. Every night for months, for years. I can't remember, I lost track. At least they never put me in that electric chair of theirs in the basement. Harriet had hard and unyielding brown eyes that took no notice of me or anyone. She was as likely to turn on you as smile at you. She drove one of her own daughters to suicide, she claimed, and it was all of Alfred Caldwell's fault, she also claimed. Those were the heady years when Harriet Nahanni and I began rallying the first of the survivors of the Alberni School to go public and sue the United Church for their injuries. We were the first. We went from victory to victory. The church went into a tailspin panic because they knew that everything we claimed about Caldwell and those like him was absolutely true. And the media at the time was eating it all up. That's one of the odd things about the plague's offspring. We don't recognize ourselves right away. Canadians stared at the evidence of their own homegrown genocide and murder and torture without heart or remembrance, as if it was some exotic tale about another group of harsh, pale people. But that couldn't have been us who did those things, I saw in their eyes. After all, Adolf Eichmann had 4 sons of his own, and he made a point of playing with them whenever he was home on leave from Auschwitz. The lawyers stepped in quickly, of course, like the ancient priests of Canaan who transferred the sins of the people onto the chosen and then banished sacrificial goats, and who even resorted to the occasional sacrifice of children to satiate the crowd. Arthur Plint was offered up to the crowd. He was a low-level dorm supervisor at the Alberni School who raped the boys there. He went to trial and got 3 years and was out in 2. The plague stepped back just then in the spring of 1998, maybe to watch what Harriet and I would do next. All during those years after the plague destroyed my marriage, my second-born daughter Eleanor spent her nights crying herself to sleep. Why she wasn't allowed to see me, her father, outside the 8 hours each week allowed by something called a court order that I stupidly obeyed made no sense to her heart and soul. Children only have their tears, and back then I had nothing left but obstinacy. Tears were comfort but no defense for either my daughter Eleanor or Maisie Shaw, who was killed by Alfred Caldwell. The boot descended anyway. Harriet and I spent many nights talking about Maisie Shaw as the newspapers announced that everything was better now. But where was Maisie buried? And what about all the other innocents who were snuffed out? You can see the evidence of what happened to them at itccs.org and by future broadcasts. Stay tuned.
So we got to support people's media, right? We got to support people's media. I do want to point this out, folks. This movement and tonight's event was not covered by corporate media at all, right? But I do want to give a big shout out to any of you who are watching me right now. Let's just acknowledge you're watching it on people's media. Wherever it is that you're watching me right now, some unpaid volunteer took the time to record it. Thank you. Some unpaid volunteer took the time to upload this, to create the infrastructure for you to watch it. So we got to support people's media. Right? We got to support people's media.
Coming clean. It's a circle of life for 11. It's a circle every which way. There's a lesson there for the giving, so go on and give it away. The wind takes a seed and away she blows. Where she stops and nobody knows, until she's bound to a little piece of ground and the life within her grows. It's a circle of life for 11. It's a circle every which way. There's a lesson there for the giving, so go on and give it away. It's a circle of life for 11. It's a circle every which way. There's a lesson there for the giving, so go on and give it away. Go on and give it away. Go on and give it away.
In every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development. We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no, to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities.